have a walk through the 2015 CERT Australia Challenge, and we have Andrew here to present, so give him a warm welcome. Go for it.
Thanks, Peter. So I think this is the third year we've run the Incident Response Challenge at BSides. Running again this year upstairs. If you're not involved already, I encourage you to go up and have a chat to the guys running it. It's a lot of fun, and this year we've got t-shirts that you can win, so give it a go. This presentation is about last year's challenge, so I'll start with a very quick sort of overview of why CERT Australia does set challenges, and then run through some of the technical details from last year's. So we've been using technical challenges in our recruitment at CERT for about 4 years now, as long as I've been there. As part of the recruitment process for technical roles, we issue the challenge to everyone who gets shortlisted. And I guess over the past couple of years especially, we've been expanding very rapidly. So we've had additional funding to grow the CERT over 3 consecutive years. We've rolled out JCSCs, we've got technical staff in all of those offices around the country, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth, with Adelaide coming online very soon. And we've recently established a 24/7 capability as well, where all of our hotline calls and incident triage is happening. So we need technical people in those teams as well. So we're getting very good at creating challenges. So we have a new one to use in each recruitment round, and we use them in events like this, I guess, to promote the CERT, but also for a bit of fun for the participants. So very quickly, the process is, we advertise the positions, we shortlist, we issue shortlisted applicants the tech challenge, and then we do the interview. So there's the opportunity to really talk to the applicant during the interview and understand what they learned from the exercise, from the technical challenge. To create the technical challenge, there's a lot of work that goes into it. Obviously we have to set up a scenario, build the hardware and software to make it happen, try and make it as realistic as possible, and package it up, and then check that it's got enough detail in it for the applicants to actually get the solution that we expect them to get at the end. So we typically run the challenge over a pretty compressed time frame. We give the applicants a weekend to do it to really test their commitment. And it's been really good to, I guess, work out not only people that have a set of technical skills that are required to solve the challenge, but also just the inclination and aptitude to want to understand what's going on with the challenge and communicate that in the report that they have to write. So that's just a bit of background. The rest of the presentation is the walkthrough from last year. I've got quite a lot of slides. I originally had 45 minutes, so this is going to get pretty long. So brace yourselves. So when we issue the challenge, we give a bit of a description of the scenario. So in this one, there was an engineer monitoring HMI. I'll explain what an HMI is in a minute. That was used in a water pumping station. They suddenly lost visibility of what was happening in their process control environment and needed to understand what happened. So in this scenario, they've escalated it to the CERT. We've undertaken incident response and been able to collect a couple of artifacts. We've got the RAM, a snapshot of the RAM from the workstation that the engineer was using, and a packet capture from the network. In reality, you probably wouldn't have either of these. This is a very artificial scenario, very much concocted, but for the purposes of the challenge, that's what we've got. So the applicants are able to use both the memory snapshot and the packet capture. Sometimes we give a preference, so we say we prefer you to focus on the the memory, but if you're having troubles with that, have a look at the packet capture. For this one we didn't. It was really up to the applicant to choose, where they wanted to start and start working through and trying to piece together what happened. So just for those of you who may not be familiar with what an HMI is, it stands for a human-machine interface. It's basically a piece of software that allows an engineer to monitor what's happening in a process control environment, whether that's energy generation and distribution, water and wastewater distribution, or even on a manufacturing floor. So often these environments are manned 24 hours a day, they're highly critical, and they are what keeps the electricity on and what keeps the water coming out of the tap. So sort of stepping back quickly and having a think about what we actually want to try and achieve from working through this exercise. We want to try and build a bit of context, extract a bit of information about the environment this workstation is operating in, try and work out what happened and when, piece together a bit of a timeline, work out how it happened, and then for the purposes of the report, we ask the applicant to write some remediation advice and think about it from the CERT's perspective. What would the CERT be doing with this? So we're typically providing advice to industry about this particular activity if it was something that might be relevant to everybody else. So we've got two artefacts. Each of them will tell us slightly different things, give us a slightly different perspective on what happened. We'll have a bit of a look at both during the walkthrough, and I guess from the memory dump perspective, we can have a look at what processes were running on the workstation, see if there's any suspicious looking processes, identify DLLs that might be malicious. We can extract artifacts from the memory dump, so files, or even try and reconstruct executables to run in a sandbox, for example. We can also identify network artifacts in the memory dump, such as the browser history. From the packet capture, we can look at what hosts are communicating, what protocols they're using, and whether there's anything unusual in terms of what we're seeing there. We can also extract files and things if they're being transferred, which is very useful. So we're going to have a look at the memory packet capture first, and we're going to use volatility to do that. Volatility is a Python tool, a free tool called the Volatility Framework. It's for analysing RAM captured from running computers. So typically a tool is used to take a snapshot of the volatile memory and it's saved to a file. What volatility does is it understands how different operating systems and different versions of operating systems use memory and how the memory structures look for the different versions of different operating systems. So one of the first steps is to identify the version of the operating system that the workstation was running, because you need to tell volatility that so that it can correctly understand the memory dump that we're using. So I'm not going to walk through how we do that. Volatility contains some utilities that allow you to do that. In this case, it's a Windows 7 workstation. I hope that's somewhat legible, because we're going to have a few of these. So the first thing, so vol.py is just a volatility script. So on the far left, you'll see a command, vol.py, and then pslist, so it just lists processes. So this is a list of processes running in the workstation at the time that the memory dump was taken. I had to delete some to fit it on the screen, but don't worry too much about the data in the columns, but I'll just run through what's in the columns to start off with. So you've obviously got the name of the executable, a process ID, its parent process, and there's a session column as well, SESS. That's like a login session. So 0 is like the system session when the computer boots, it creates a system session. 1 is an active login session. So we'll have a look. There's another command that will show us those sessions in a bit more detail. And we also get the start time for each process. So looking at the sort of system process, we get a bit of an idea of when the machine started, which is all the dates are on the same date. This was all done in a very compressed time frame. So 2:59:47, the computer's turned on. There's a win login, about 6 from the top, which is at 2:59:49. So this computer actually automatically logged in when it booted up, and a user session started. Looking down towards the bottom, you'll see iExplore, so Internet Explorer and Acrobat are running. And then right at the bottom, there's some pretty interesting looking processes, PowerShell, command.exe and client.exe. So it gives us a very quick overview of what's running on the machine, what the relationship between parent and children is, and what time process was started, and whether or not they're running an interactive session or not. Volatility has a few different ways of representing this process information. So PS tree just shows you that parent-child hierarchy. So this one, I guess, shows the relationship between different processes. Up the top you can see PowerShell created the command.exe process, which created the client.exe process, which is quite interesting. And that's probably the most interesting one. There's also the advanced HMI application down at the bottom. What we notice is, I wanted to mention, the HMI starts very early on, so I'll just go back. HMI is right in the middle. So it started at 3 o'clock, which is roughly 20 seconds after the machine booted. So it was set up to auto run, so that's the application that the engineer uses. We suspect at this stage. And the PowerShell stuff happens about 28 minutes later at 3:28. So there's a fairly significant gap there. I mentioned those sessions. So the sessions command just groups all of the processes by the session that they're in. So you can see that in the session 0, all these sort of system type processes are running. And then session 1 is where you've got all those userland processes, Internet Explorer and PowerShell and client.exe. So you can sort of get a feel for how those processes might have been created. Another thing you can do with volatility is just list the command line parameters that a process was started with. I've pulled out a few there. And you can also see which directory the executable is contained in. So advanced HMI is in program files directory, which is where you'd expect to see a legitimate application. There's an Acrobat one with a PDF file running, open up in Acrobat Reader. Then command.exe was used to run a second command, which is the client.exe, and that's running from quite an unusual location, which is a temporary directory within the user's folder. So there's, I guess, a picture we're painting here about this client.exe process, which is that it's a little bit unusual, and we probably want to understand a bit more about what it's doing. I should have said at the start, obviously there's a lot of ways to approach this, and this is just one. I actually was one of 2 people that created this challenge, so when I'm thinking about it, I know where the end point is, so I've sort of got a very directed path through the challenge. Obviously, for people who haven't seen the artefacts before, there's a lot more work involved to try different things and eliminate different possibilities for what actually happened. So just looking at what we got out of that very quick examination of the processes, we see that advanced HMI started at 3 o'clock UTC. This is likely to be the HMI application that the engineer reported lost visibility. Started at about the time of login. And we see Internet Explorer and Acrobat Reader started around 317, 325, and these applications are often used to as a infection vector for malware, so they're something to keep on the radar. And then we see these suspicious processes around the PowerShell, CMD, and client.exe that ran sort of right at the end. So what can we find out about this advanced HMI? Can we dig into it a little bit and see whether it's what it's communicating with on the network, what it might look like on the screen? There's actually a screenshot command in volatility, so it's able to pull out this wireframe diagram of what the Windows application actually looks like. It's actually a whole screenshot, so you've got the Windows Start button on the bottom left there. The HMI applications up the top. So you can see the title bars from each of the little panels in the application. So you can see there's a Kings Lake pump station, there's a pump voltage, and a pressure region on the screen, and then there's some reset buttons as well. So it sort of gives you just from the memory snapshot, you're able to pull out something that gives you an indication of what the engineer was actually looking at. Just as a bit of insight to where we're going, so there's actually a couple of gauges there. There's a pump voltage gauge and a pressure gauge. They're actually showing the engineer a couple of values from a water pump controller. So what else can we find out about this advanced HMI process? So its process ID was 2360. So I've run the netscan command and just filtered out the network activity associated with that process. And you can see there it's got an established connection to port 502 on a remote computer 172.172.200. Does anyone know what port 502 is? Modbus, correct. So port 502 is a well-known port used by Modbus. Modbus is a communications protocol that's been around for a very long time, has very little security built into it, and it's used to interact with process control devices. So there's a photo of an example of one there. Yeah, so that's what Modbus is. So then we can have a look for if there's any other Modbus traffic in the memory dump. So here I've just stripped out the port 502 traffic. And what we see is we see once again advanced HMI is there at the top, but then client.exe has 5 TCP sessions that it's had with 3 different hosts on port 502, the Modbus port. So that's interesting in itself that this client.exe is actually appears to be using the Modbus protocol for something. So now I've jumped into the packet capture file just using Wireshark, and I've filtered out the TCP session which is at the top here. So it's uniquely identified by that port 49159, the client port. And so Wireshark understands Modbus. We can see up at the top there highlighted it says read holding registers. So this is the HMI application sending a Modbus command to some remote device asking to read 2 registers in this case. If you look down the bottom, you can see the two values that are returned from that request. So there's a value 47 and a value 68. So these are basically values that represent something happening in the logic of the process controller that the HMI is able to interpret and present to the engineer. Also notice that the time here is very early on, it's 3:01, so this is likely to be before anything bad happened later on. Having a look at another one of those TCP sessions, so this is one of the ones that the client.exe process ran. We can see there's a very short TCP session, basically initiates the three-way handshake and then sends a FIN. So it sort of looks like a TCP connect scan. And that's to host 201, which is a different host. Okay, so just going back to this list of connections that we were able to pull out of the memory dump. The second one, sorry, no, I think it's the third one. Anyway, there's a different command sent. So in this TCP session, which is happening right at the end, it's at 3:33. There's a command sent to write multiple registers. And what it's doing is it's overriding 64 registers with the value 0. So this is a modbus command that's being sent by client.exe to overwrite a whole lot of registers in that PLC device. If we have a look again at that initial session, but much later on after that write registers command, so the HMI is still calling the device, asking for the values from those two registers, and now we see it seeing zeros because the values were overwritten. So this might explain why the engineer thought they lost visibility of what was happening at the remote controller. All of a sudden the values on the HMI application swung down to 0 and they wonder what on earth happened. So at this point we know that an advanced HMI uses Modbus to interact with a single host, the .200 host. If you had a look at the timings in the packet capture, you'd see it reads those two registers every half second. So it's updating very regularly. And initially those values were around 47 and 68 respectively. We also found that client.exe used Modbus to send a write multiple registers command. It also looked like it was possibly doing some TCP connect scanning on port 502. And that write command set 64 registers to a 0 value. And then we saw following that the HMI was receiving 0 values in response to its read registers request. So we've got a bit of a picture of what happened. It's very high level. There's still some pretty tricky questions to be answered. So how did that client.exe get there? What triggered that PowerShell to command 32 to client.exe process path? And what did it do? What did that client.exe command do? We know it possibly did some scanning. It looks like it overwrote some registers, but that's just based on a few artifacts. It could be a lot more to what that actual process was able to do. Was it, working of its own accord, or was it interacting with a command and control server? There's all these sort of unknowns about that particular application that we need to dig into a bit more. So taking a step back, we can go back to the memory capture and volatility and try and look at maybe the browsing history. We saw Internet Explorer was running. So I've highlighted the URLs, some of the URLs that were returned by that command here. There's a bit of a theme going on with the top 4 at least around water systems and what will look to be vendors of control systems type products. And then the one at the bottom is really odd. There's this http://localhost/stage2.html, which sounds very sus. So we could try and dig into those a bit more. Using Wireshark, we can have a look at some of the requests that were sent to those hosts. I've very quickly narrowed in here on a suspicious zip file that came from anytechwater.com. So we can actually extract this zip file from the PCAP and have a look at it, see if there's anything interesting in there. I've just done a listing of the contents of the zip file to give you a bit of a feel for what's in it. So there's two screens of this. The first screen is really some Windows APIs, and at the top what look to be some Python libraries. There's also, wow, there's a client.exe in there, that's interesting, and a whole lot of Python artifacts. So looks like possibly this could be an executable that was built using Python to exe or something like that. Maybe. There was an egg file there, so eggs are basically Python libraries of Python files that are zipped together, so you can literally unzip an egg file, which is what I've done here. I've just listed the contents of that egg file. We can see a client.py there, modbus.py, server.py. So there's a whole lot of Python code that we could pull out and have a look at to try and understand what client does, client.exe. So just having a look at the top of client.py, we see at the very top there a reference to DNS shell client. That's something to take a note of. We see a whole lot of imports of crypto and Modbus routine. Reference to DNS resolver. That's interesting. What would it be using DNS for? And then below that we see some configuration data. It's using port 53. It's got a domain, waterwiser.gov.au, and then starts initializing some crypto algorithms. So we've got a lot more time than we have now. You can read through this script in a lot of detail to get a pretty clear picture of what that client.exe's capabilities are. So I mentioned DNS shell. You can Google that. It's actually a bit of code from GitHub that allows you to use DNS for command and control. So client.exe has actually been written to query a DNS server to receive commands for what it's going to do when it's interacting with the network. So if we go back to the packet capture, we can actually have a look at some of this command and control traffic. So I've just homed in on the DNS traffic here and found a request to the waterwiser.gov.au domain. You can see down the bottom there in the text of that DNS query, there's a basic or uncoded string. So you can pull that out, decode it, have a look at it. Probably need to decrypt it. You've got all the keys in the Python, so the way to go. Alright, so we've got a pretty good picture of what client.exe does now. The only remaining question that we're going to answer now is how did the malware get there? So I just jumped back to, I'm running out of time, but on this slide there's softwares.html and there's software.html, which were a bit odd, so why would you have both of those? I went and had a look at softwares.html. It's this very suspicious looking piece of JavaScript and Visual Basic script, which if you go through and have a look at, you can see it's actually a browser exploit going on here. So this, and another snippet from that file is that you can pull out the set of commands that it ran to download that zip file, unzip it, and execute that client.exe process. So that's all happening in the browser. And that's just a screenshot of proof of concept for an exploit of the vulnerability in Internet Explorer that we actually used to create the challenge. So basically there was a vulnerability in IE that allowed you just browse to a page and without knowing you save a file to disk and execute it. So it's a pretty significant vulnerability. That's quite an old one. It's only in IE 11, it's quite an old one. But HMIs often run on workstations that are not updated very often, so it's not unrealistic for the scenario. So just to wrap it up very quickly, that was a really quick run through of the challenge. So you had a watering hole website that the engineer browsed to, which resulted in the delivery of a malware payload to their workstation. That malware then started sending out DNS queries to a command and control server, waiting for commands, telling me what to do, telling me what to do. It actually did some scanning of the whole subnet that it was connected to, found all of the hosts running Modbus, so it just did basically a connect scan on port 502 to the whole subnet. It found those 3 hosts that we saw earlier, and it sent that whiteboard registers to all of those Modbus engineers. So that's basically it. Thank you.